I never intended to play chess professionally. Never took money targeted for that purpose. I was always set on a university career in academics doing mathematical research. And I do work in computational complexity theory, which is known for the P versus NP problem, traveling salesman problem, maybe you've heard of.
I have.
And so actually did very little work in chess. So for two 10-year periods, 86 to 96, when I got tenure, the published parenting, and then the 10 years after that, then the toiletgate scandal happened in 2006. And Frederick Friedel said over the open chat line, which I was on, is there anyone qualified to evaluate the kind of statistical allegations in Danilov's letter? And I realized that I was qualified. And I felt responsibility to jump to the aid of the game. And I worked up a qualitative model first, and then a quantitative model. And and I can go into that story.
Has that model changed over time? I mean, this was your first foray. Have you had time to fine tune it, or has it needed fine tuning?
It has had several updates, but it reached its predictive analytic form by 2011, just in time for the Sebastian Feller case.
So, just out of curiosity, what were your conclusions on the Sebastian Feller case?
I could use Cyril Margelot's confession as a public version, and I've been doing this since 2013. So it was a z-score well above the FIDE threshold. In Margelot's case, the four games that were featured in his confession. The actual was based on privileged information, private, having to do with the cell phone, but the score is very similar. So it was, and you could not get this conclusion by using the entirety of the 9 games. With the entirety of the 9 games, it was just a 1.58 z-score, not even above 2.
What would your comment be to someone who is a strong player, who isn't going there innocently, and who has these kinds of opinions based on these kinds of observations? What would you say to them? What would your opinion be? You said small data.
So the first thing is most important to say is that my system is set up so that all judgments are rendered based on evaluation of enormous size data sets. Okay, so tens of thousands of games by players of all rating levels.
Okay.
And in fact, I've even rejected some statistically potentially sharper methods because those would involve regression over the player's own small data. So I do not apply a minimization step to the player's own data. Just count things up according to standards set by large data. I have generally found that when people make, grandmaster interpretation and chess positions, what is a computer move, what is not, I can more often or just as often find that this is contradicted by my quantitative method as sustained. I'd have to dig into the past for some really good examples of this.
Could you give one?
Of people saying, certain moves are unbelievable. Although on James Altucher's podcast, we did look at a critical moment in the Carlsen Niemann game, where Niemann played the E3 move, and show that the chess engine dithers a little bit back and forth between that and knight c4 as black's best move.
Okay.
So at any rate, as I said, my system deliberately does not use specific chess knowledge. It's all based on the quantitative data from the computer's evaluations of the moves, transplanted into a utility function, and then that's fed into a predictive analytic model that really works in a broadly similar way to how economists base predictive analytic models on utility functions.
The Hans Niemann case.
Right.
You were called in to do this analysis, or did you just do this because you were just curious?
I have been doing, so let me actually say one more thing for backgrounds before we get into this.
Please.
I have a two-stage system, designed on purpose, the screening stage and then the full test stage. The screening stage is for rapid computation. I can often have a screening report within an hour of the last game finishing in a tournament. And in fact, I did that today for the World Cadets Championship in Batumi, and also for the Terra Finals in the UK. I had more of a delay. So this is like compiling a box score. So I don't know if you're a soccer fan, cricket fan, what sport I could use for the analogy. But for instance, the screening stage, counts the raw number of agreements with the engine and the total errors on moves that the engine doesn't like, and then compares those with coefficients derived from analyzing really hundreds of thousands of games, and then puts this on the normal scale, the bell curve scale, except I use the scale, as scientists often do, of 100 coin flips with expectation 50 and standard deviation 5. Okay, now you can judge soccer games. So if you have a soccer game, a football game that ends 5-3, that's a relatively high scoring game. And then you can decide, well, what my screening test doesn't tell you is whether the 5-3 score was obtained in a driving rainstorm, or whether it was a dry, sunny day where people might be more likely to be able to maneuver the ball. So what my full test does is it judges the difficulty of the games. Okay, so I convey the screening scores, your rapid deployment of large amounts of data, and you look at the high outliers, and that gives arbiters instant information about whom to watch. And then if a further stage is needed, then we go to the full test, which takes a lot longer because it uses the multi-PV playing mode of the engine, and the analysis of each game takes 4 to 8 hours instead of 15 minutes. So I have therefore, screening is easy for me to do. So I've been screening the Grand Chess Tour for 6 years now, regularly. So when Carlsen lost to Niemann, I submitted my report that evening, a few hours after the game. And I had some comments to go with that report. But the screening scores on the whole remain normal for the whole tournament. And I have in fact a file where I have Niemann's screening score after 5 rounds in the Sinquefield Cup, because that was when I took this file to show people. Now I am on public record from the press release of the tournament that the full test stage does not find any indication of cheating either. In fact, I feel I can say that I do tests of concordance to various engines, and there are various combinations of games and moves. I can cherry pick things. So depending on the combination that I get C scores between 0.74 and 1.58, and all of those are in the completely normal range. So
what would be the range where you would, let's say, we would consider, let's say, not necessarily a red flag, but warning, we're coming into the danger zone?
So there are 2 considerations, and this we got into at the very start. So the question is whether there is other evidence, observational or behavioral evidence, such as a player getting up to go to the bathroom a lot, perhaps indication of suspicious signaling, whether, in a couple of cases, wires have been sticking out, and, maybe some doubt as to whether they were really observed. But
has that actually happened, or were you just conjecturing here?
Oh, it's actually happened. This is in the public record of some of the cases I've been involved
don't worry about that.
with.
It's nothing. That's just my normal antenna. It comes out of my shirt all the time.
Yes. I mean, well, the Ricciardi case in 2015 was a hidden camera in a necktie, through which an accomplice was viewing the game. And in the case of Ivan Tedemov, also in the public record, there were wires observed, and So when there is other evidence, and also with Jens Kotini, so when there is other evidence, then that's when the threshold of 2.50 applies, because there are observations about the player that take him outside the hoi polloi of the several thousand players playing FIDE-rated chess every weekend.
Sure.
So you have a lower comparison base. But if there is no other evidence, then you need a much higher threshold. And in fact, I'm not sure what the status is right now after the meetings at the Chennai Olympiad, but it has been FIDE policy that statistical reasoning may not be used for judgment alone for over-the-board chess.
It sounds like that's the famous story of, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes?
Well, yeah, but the threshold that was proposed for that for in-person chess is 5.0, which happens to be the scientific standard for discovery. But the main point is the face value odds are 3.5 million to 1. If you divide by upwards of 100,000, let's see, 100 divided by 100,000 would only get you 35 to 1 per year. So maybe you should close for over-the-board chess as opposed to online chess, maybe it's closer to 50,000. That gets you toward 100 to 1 odds.
Okay.
After hashing things out. So that's the reason why you need 5.0. Am I doing this right? Wait, 20 times 6. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, not quite 100 from 50,000 to 1. So in fact, actually, the way I put it is, if you use this threshold, how many years would elapse between errors? Okay, something like the Dutch nurse case, although that was incorrectly analyzed from the beginning. And so I think an error rate of 1 in 30, 1 in 40 years is acceptable. But now for online chess, it's a different story for 2 reasons. One, the Bayesian prior is much higher. Okay, so 1 to 2% instead of 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 5,000 prior probability. But leavening that is the fact that there are so many more games played online. So therefore, there's much more opportunity for unusual performances to happen just by natural chance.
Simply because of the volume of games being produced.
The volume of games. I mean, so Littlewood's law says that if you observe 1 million happenings, one of them will have 1 million to 1 prior probability, which is a common definition of a miracle. So if you see 1 million things a day, then a miracle happens every day. And in online chess, 1 million games per day is the norm.
This is true, but not necessarily for one player.
Right. But you have to say, how does that player stand against the backdrop of other players? Now, with Niemann, you get a further complication. He is in the world's top 100 players. That is a more refined data set for comparison.
But even the top 100 players, at least online, play a lot.
Yes. And Niemann especially has played a lot.
Okay. So that brings up a question that I was actually going to bring up. How have you had the opportunity to analyze his online games as well?
Yes. So in fact, actually,
rapid chess, roulette, or both, or
so this is what I'm going to show you. So what you should see now is this is in my public area fidelity data. So if you go, this is my public website.
So everybody can access this?
Everybody can access this. It's listed from my professional page. So this is, if you just Google Regan Buffalo, you'll find my professional page as a professor of computer science engineering at the University at Buffalo. I have lots of things here. My professional papers, my teaching, some creative writing, my own chess site, especially with endgames. But I have this Fidelity Chess Research site. So you click through that. This is my public page.
Okay.
Now behind here, I have my private pages, but the data extension is is public. So now, by the way, the main principle that explained the toiletgate anonymity is that if the games are very forcing, and if the computer's moves have much higher value than any other move, chances are a human player is going to find them as well as a computer. And
This
that's
was
how.
actually my conclusion, actually, watching Niemann versus Mamedyarov, actually.
Okay.
I'll be honest with you. Once they got past the opening, let's say at around move 17, I felt that it was the player from Azerbaijan who was forcing the line. I mean, he kept pushing things that left Niemann with very few options, really, other than to commit suicide or play the move that was the only way that wasn't going to commit suicide. And for about 10 moves that happened. Then by the end of the 10 moves, in which he had basically been, just responding to Mamedyarov's, let's say, aggressive attempts, Mamedyarov was lost. And I just concluded, well, it wasn't so much Niemann who won the game as Mamedyarov who managed to lose it all by himself.
Right. And that has been my conclusion in several other cases of this nature. But this was my conclusion, especially in the second game of the Topalov-Kramnik match, which I think is what upset the Bulgarians the most, because Topalov should have won that game brilliantly, and then he ultimately lost it. And I do reproduce Kramnik matching the computer way over 80%. But my model actually also gives a very similar projection, just because most of Kramnik's moves were forced. And so I have full record of that. So I'll just click it through for the moment.
Sure. And
the key item is let's see, it's evidence here. Is this the key one? Let's see. No, let's see, chess base heroes now, methodology data. Yes, this is the key one here. Although it's 85 match rate in raw terms, so this so the other thing is pretty random. And in particular, this was the key thing, because this was actually discussion that I had with someone who initially believed Topalov's accusation. And the point is, when you remove the clearly forced moves, the few moves that were left over included 2 clear mistakes, 4 agreements with the engine, and 5 cases where there were multiple optimal moves. So this was just much of a muchness. So I wrote this in October 2006. And this principle also comes into play in the Niemann Magnus games. This is my model reaching the similar conclusion that in that game, Black's play especially was very clear cut. However, what I want to show you pertains to your question about Niemann's other games.
Right.
So it's not actually linked, but I regard my data site as public. Okay, well, actually you see a blank page. So now let's type Niemann. And here we are. So I just created this today, although I've circulated this privately for a week. So I have 3 main exhibits here. And as you see, I'm going to be contrasting Niemann and Igor Rausis. So you asked me about online chess. So this is a record of my results of my weekly screening, done continuously during the pandemic since January 2020, in fact. All my record of all the tournaments Niemann has played in. There, I think, are 106 data points here. And this includes, by the way, I compiled this file 5 games into the Sinquefield Cup. So there's my screen for the Sinquefield Cup. I mean, he played a little, was in trouble against Lenier Dominguez Perez, but he still was undefeated at that point. And so his screening score was 56, which, 55 is 1 standard deviation up from 50. Okay. And so this is, in the normal range, and it's also smack in the middle of the Z-scores that I later reported, done with my full model. I said, this is just the screening, which does not take into account the difficulty of the games. It's a pure box score of, which you could have in soccer. Now, There are, I think, 106 data points in this file, and the median data point in this file is this one. 49.8 ROI, Serbian Team Championship Premier Division a year ago. Okay. So in other words, this record is pretty well centered on 50. Okay. Now, this uses some of these events, so where they're online, the events use my pandemic lag adjustment of his rating. But the in-person events in Europe that I get from my weekly screening, I don't apply that formula, so they are his FIDE rating at the time. Incidentally, the Coinbase tournaments have a lot of his lower scores. So the chess.com Rapid Championship.
Is that because of the time? Because remember that during this, let's say I can see some events dated from 2020 and others from 2022.
Right.
And as is well recorded, he has had a huge evolution, in rating and presumably in chess strength over that period of 2 months. So it would actually not be very strange if 2 years ago he was performing.
Well, Coinbase was this year though, April 2022, okay. And I'm using his higher rating now. So there were two things about that evolution. So, but let me I'll just finish with this, then I'll address this. So this is centered on 50. Moreover, 60 is my 2 sigma line, and to be above 2 sigma in the bell curve is a roughly 1 in 44 chance. I've got 106 data points, so divide 106 by 44, you expect 2 or 3, and there are 3 above. There's also 1 below 2 sigma over here in Coinbase, so that's really par for the course. And between 1 sigma up and 1 sigma down, you should have 68% of the data points falling, and pretty much what I've highlighted is 68% of, it's a little above and a little below. So this is very much a normal bell curve, about as normal as you can get. If I take only his OTB tournaments, I get this smaller number of data points. The median of this is this, it's just slightly above 50. The Sharjah Masters in May. And the one thing I want to say is that fairly often I only have 7 games from a 9-game tournament like the Vergani Cup. And that's because I don't have the games that were not broadcast, like in early rounds, he may not have been on a top board. So in particular, this record is biased toward broadcast games. Okay, so, but it's also still fairly normal. I have nothing 2 sigma down. I've got 2, so 1 or 2 is what you'd expect from 50 odd. Have you
been able to, let's say, within as much as possible, have you been able to, let's say, separate or compare your analysis from similar periods of games that were not broadcast with games that were broadcast? There was a tweet.
I'd
just like to mention. There's been a tweet that's been circulating very recently.
So the tweet that was circulated. So this, by the way, is the #1 thing that I have been saying with Frederick Friedel and ChessBase all the time.
Okay.
So, which is, we have to stand for science. The tweet was circulated with none of the scientific requirements of commentary, of comparison. That tweet, the chart in that tweet was picked apart by the U.S. Master Todd Bryant, and that was put on Facebook by Steve James. So it's not. What the information there was not accurate. For instance, some tournaments that were claimed to be broadcast only had 3 rounds broadcast in real time. So, so there's a lot of necessary dotting of I's and crossing of T's that people who are scientists know should be required. And you should not even talk about anything that does not meet that very basic level of standards.
I have to bring the point up because there is an audience out there who isn't necessarily going to be sticking to just the most scientific rigor possible, and who will be there for like it or not, asking questions based on things such as that tweet.
Right,
And
but
that's
I'd like
why I
to
need
see
to get
chess
you at least to be able
base.
to address these comments and say, what's wrong with that data? Why should you not be listening to it? Why is it so fallible that it should be ignored completely?
Well, that's or at least you should be attuned to listen for the rebuttal, and people just aren't online. I am, by the way, right now team teaching my department's freshman seminar on the internet and society. And so several of my colleagues, as well as I, are devising units showing the fallibility of the internet and how one needs to read it. So that's the thing. But scientific method, again, but I would love for ChessBase. Frederick's from Oxford, like I am. So that experience. So we know he's associated with scientists. So I think that would be a very great service to stand for this. So I have more controlling factors of this. Now let me show the contrast, and then I'm going to go into the issue of the rating upflow. Okay. So at the time of the Rausis case breaking, there were 24 observable tournaments. For some reason, I have only 19 in this file. This is a file that I compiled at the time. This is various versions of Stockfish because I pulled this. This is over a longer series of years, October 2014 through summer 2019, when he was caught more or less red-handed. But the point of it, these are all, except for 5, these were all the tournaments that were covered in ChessBase updates over the week in chess. And every single Z-score, every single ROI score is above 50. Okay. There are a lot of them are in the 40 to 60 normal range, but they're at the top of it. So this guy is doing above average with regularity. Now, numerically, it's a very similar situation. Over a slightly longer period of time, he rose from near 2,500 to nearly 2,700. Okay. And he's confessed to cheating in part, and people believe that he cheated in small increments, so moderate cheating. But this shows up in my screening score. Every single one is above average. It's the Lake Wobegon effect, as it's called. All the children are above average. So that's a definite contrast. So the allegation against Niemann is that he might have been doing similar. But since the numbers and ELO levels are entirely similar, if that were the case, then I should be seeing something closer to this rather than something like this, which is absolutely entirely normal, or this with just the in-person chess. So the point is, I don't even see anything halfway to Rausis.
So you're saying that basically the curve that actually sits there going from, let's say, below to above throughout the entire cycle is actually a sign of healthy rating variation and performance rating variation.
Right.
As you may have heard, I don't know if you're aware about it. There was a declaration by chess.com via their Twitter account, a message by Danny Ranch, in which he justified their removal of Hans Niemann from their Global Chess Championship event by saying that they had uncovered a series of other cheating instances. There's really no other way to put it. And they were waiting for Hans Niemann to explain this. I bring this up because I noticed that in your list of of events and whatever that you had actually uncovered, that there was a number of events on chess.com and so forth mentioned in the list of rapid events. And I was wondering if you had analyzed these and if you had actually flagged anything unusual.
And I have been dialoguing with chess.com, and so the I not at liberty to say there's some right in both camps, let's just say, as far as what chess.com said. And I said, it's their business, but I've made my data available, and they can decide. Some of it, as you know, the statement makes a point of saying also that they do not believe that Hans Niemann has represented himself correctly. So it's as much a question about the language of what Niemann said as the results, and I'll just say that element is also relevant. So,
Okay.
that's as
So
far
you're
as I'll
privy
say
to
for that.
something about something he said. When you say represented himself, it's not so much that he said he didn't cheat or did cheat. It's just, let me say, the details of the story involving chess.com.
Right, that's right.
Most of the claims, the popular claims, is that the broadcast games are the ones that are the most suspicious, because that would presumably be, let's say, facilitating the cheating elements.
Yeah.
If
So,
they weren't
what I'm
broadcast, then
saying
no.
is, as justifying my not needing to take the time to go individually each term and see which were broadcast, which were broadcast not.
Sure.
As I'm saying is, if there's any bias in my data, it's toward broadcast games, and yet I show something entirely normal.
Okay.
So now, so the website Pawn the Lies by Weatherall, let's say about is what's the name? Caleb Weatherall.
Okay.
Claims to have simulated, based on the FIDE rating at the time and the ratings of the opponents, the expected number of points that Niemann should have. And they're claiming that his performance, which was 215 expected points, is, it's 20 points more than the expectation of 195. And I guess I'm not sure whether these are meant to be sigmas. This is, he writes mu, so I only noticed this today, but it's in response to this that I decided to come out with my own data contradicting this. Now this, however, this is mathematically reasonable. This is, take his FIDE rating, apply the logic of the rating formula, which makes projections for the outcome of the games, do random trials and take the averages of the trials, and he's saying that the true number of points Niemann scored is higher, significantly higher. I don't know how many sigmas higher than that. Now, what I'm doing instead is I'm looking at the intrinsic quality of the move. So I'm closer. I'm using data that's more direct. And one thing important is I'm not doing data at the unit of games and points scored. I'm doing data at the level of thousands of moves. So I have a lot more data. Now, the poster child data point to tell you to express this contrast is my screening score with Stockfish 11 for the Havana Kappa Memorial, which Niemann won with 7.5 out of 9. And this has been alleged as one of his suspicious tournaments. Okay, so he scored 7.5 out of 9, more than expected, but my screening score for him is below the expectation of 50. Okay. So
what does that mean? The screening score?
So this is my ROI, Raw Outlier Index screening score, which is mapped to the coin flip distribution, where 50 heads out of 100 coin flips is the expectation, and the standard deviation is 5. Okay.
So you're saying that he actually underperformed?
Yes, he underperformed in raw accuracy terms relative to the Stockfish 11 engine. I've also taken this with respect to Komodo 13.3, and actually I've done some of this, these terms I've done with the latest engines as well.
So
not much different.
Just to see if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly.
Yeah.
Based on computer analysis of the moves, based on the formula you've applied, he, in terms of the accuracy of his moves relative to his result, he actually should have scored higher. And yes, if there is a red flag, or let's say a flag that's causing this very unusually high score of 7.5, which people are, screaming bloody murder about, it's his opponents who obviously have made even more egregious mistakes to achieve that.
Yeah, possibly. Yes. In fact, actually, that I should check that. So the other data point is Sigmund, because he won that tournament too. And okay, there he is above 50%, but less than 1 sigma above. Okay, so that's
how many sigmas above would you be worried about?
well from screening.
On normal, in
Sure.
a normal case, just
Yeah,
casually.
70 is my red line. And
Okay, so
65
53
my
is way
amber
down
line.
there then.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I said these are the only scores. Now, I mean, there has been comment on his GM norm at the Charlotte to October 2020. I think Andre Poonen addressed this, and I haven't actually had time to listen to Andre Poonen's video yet. I think there's one in Ukrainian, but maybe there's one in English too. So this, however, though, I have lower screening scores with the other engines, and I did do the full test on this, and the full test scores are lower. So I mean, that just happens. There's normal scientific variation. But this anyway is not in the red zone or even in my amber alert zone, which is 65.
Okay.
So this is just somebody playing well. And
Right.
it's the playing well out of 50 chances to play well that's likely to happen. Now, actually, let me unshare for a moment, and you just suggested something that I can add to my website. So let me, in fact, do that. I can add my screening files of the Havana and Sigmund tournaments. I think those are fair game for the public. So let me just do that here.
Okay.
So Havana Star 2022.
I was telling a friend that who was commenting on the rating evaluation. I said, look, I can't speak for it. I mean, he's a young player who's been growing enormously, and I would estimate that it's pretty natural even to have a certain degree of inconsistency, regardless of natural statistical variance. I know that when I first made my breakthrough, I jumped 350 ELO in a single ratings list.
Yes, and so did I.
But yeah, and it was like I was 1880, and suddenly I was 2230 FIDE, and I said, look, I would love to say that I was a consistent 2230 player, but I never knew who was going to appear at the board one day or the next for at least a year. One day I'd be playing like a complete idiot, and another like a genius. It was.
And that is a factor that I admit I haven't necessarily comped completely in the 2 weeks since this came up, or more generally. So I myself, actually, I had 2.5 years of stagnating in the 2200s, low 2200s. And then I played in a tournament over Thanksgiving 1975, and I defeated Walter Brown in round 2, defeated Mark Deason in round 3, drew with Sal Matera in round 4, drew with Pal Banco in round 5, or maybe vice versa.
And this was only with Fritz 7 helping you.
And then Art Bisquire ground me down with 2 bishops against Bishop and Knight in 100 moves in round 6. So I didn't win a prize, but I did win 160 rating points, and that qualified me to be on the U.S. student team in 1976.
Okay.
And there have been cases where I have regarded this mercuriality, suddenly having very good results, as indications of promise. So I want to show one more example out of the last bit of data that I've teed up to show, and this actually also came up in the previous example, and that is the meteoric rise of Fabiano Caruana. So I'll show it just to my browser. So again, this is a possibly relevant point of comparison with Niemann. From the January 2006 rating list, he was only 2409. And then by October 2007, less than 2 years, he had shot up 200 rating points. Now, if you want to use exactly the Niemann numbers, in October 2006, he's 2474, and then he hits 2700 by July 2010. So that's a little bit longer period of time. But in fact, a year earlier, in late 2009, so exactly the same time frame, he's already up to 2652. In fact,
I made actually a similar comparison in terms of, let's say, late bloomers, because young children or young players at a certain degree, this is actually fairly standard, with Levin Aronian, who at the age of 21 was a little over was 25 80 or something, and he was no, there's nothing to to say, oh my gosh, this guy is going to be incredible. And 3 years later, he's the number 3 player in the world.
So that's actually another thing about general science appreciation, that there is a lot of variety of data points, and that that you cannot cherry pick things. That's one thing that chess players do all the time. That's one reason, in fact, why I'm generally very guarded with my data, because people might cherry pick my high outliers. If I've got 750 players, one of them's going to be top in my list. And if you were just quartiling, then you would say that guy's a 3 sigma outlier, because 3 sigma is just under 750, 1 in 750 natural frequency. So, but people cherry pick on Facebook all the time, like, cases of vaccines going badly for people. So
let me get back to it. Have you flagged anything unusual for? I understand that your overall data says that there's nothing to condemn Hans Niemann his performances as cheating. There are 2 things that I'm still nagging me regarding all of this, and not your results. The first is, you've mentioned that Panelize has made data that with some reasonable means, but his data obviously has reached some very different conclusions. Is this simply because he's using less information, or is there something fallible in the methodology that he's using? Why is there such a discrepancy?
It's a good question, and it's really a question of what are you looking for, and whether there are possible systematic explanations for things. So in fact, let me now.
One thing that just came to me, just at least when I was looking at this, because what I understood is that he's basically analyzed it relative to the rating of the player at the time. He's rated, 2,500, and he outperformed it by so many points.
Right.
Now, if he's actually growing as fast as he is, then every time he actually is performing, then of course his rating will be lower than what he's actually worth.
Right. So that's true. And someone, taking the time, which I don't have at the moment, to do the perspiration work, to do the grunt work, should go through, he should publish his list of what ratings he used at the time. Okay, and you should compare that with my ratings, where some of them, the online ones all do have my pandemic lag adjustment, but a lot of these in-person chess ones don't. And some of these might be, like this might be a USCF rating though. Like whatever came in the file, because I did this en masse without knowing that Hans Niemann was going to be a major case in December 2020.
Of course.
So you should do that kind of in-depth comparison to see if the nature of the contradiction, if there really is one. However, what I've just done is I've added a lot more stuff to my page. So let's now look with Stockfish 15. Here we go, Stockfish 15 at the Havana Kappa Mem. And let's look at Niemann versus his opponents. And let's see if he scored points more because his opponents played badly than because he played well. Now, let's see, the average rating in the tournament is 2589, by game 2589. So Niemann a little bit above the median in the fields, but not a lot of difference. So now this, with respect to Stockfish 15, Niemann's ROI was right on the button, the expectation button. Now, so he matched the computer 59.5%.
This is the tournament he won, right?
In the tournament he won. He matched Stockfish 15 a little higher, but also his error was a little higher, although it's among the lowest error of this group. The Yilmaz had a lower error, also lower first move match, and a slightly higher ROI. In fact, he has the highest ROI with his even score. But the ROI figure is really tightly bunched around 50. I don't compute an ROI from the average of the opponent's ratings. I could, and my full test thing could do similar. But the number that stands out to me here, though, is that this error figure, 0.152, this is my scaled version of average center pawn loss. And this is notably higher than the other figures. There's one that's close to it. So Luis Quesada Perez had a fair bit of luck from his opponents, but Niemann's opponents played clearly the worst.
Okay, so basically, it's not so much Niemann who's. What you're saying is that Niemann's accuracy wasn't standoutish in any way. It was what stood out mostly was how poorly his opponents were playing against him.
Right. So that often happens. You know, I don't want to take things away from people, but in famous cases
this is
where
just numbers.
A 2200 player has beaten several high GMs, the reason is that the high GM didn't play like a high GM. Actually, here's one case. So I did intrinsically rate the Deep Blue versus Kasparov matches. Oh. And this is in a paper published and invited for the Springer Verlag Lecture Notes in Computer Science 10,000 issue anniversary. It's a prestigious issue. And I measured Deep Blue playing in the mid 2800s and Kasparov playing under 2600 for both matches combined.
Okay.
So Kasparov didn't play at Kasparov's level.
Could this be because he was adjusting his play to the engine?
Or it could be that he went on tilt, especially in the last game.
No, the last game, of course, is a special case. But if you look at the first game, some of the games that he played, let's say against Deep Thought, before maybe Deep Blue, there was definitely some anti-computer strategy involved. And this, of course, a normal engine might say, "Oh, he's playing much worse." Yeah. But this might have been suited against his opponent.
I start with turn 9, so I don't do turns. So anti-computer strategy in turns 1 to 8 will be ignored. But from turn 9 onward, yeah. So anyway, let's see if that's also the case in Sigma. Let's see, we'll say, do you want Comodo 13.3? Let's do that. So
whatever you feel is adequate. They're also strong. I can't imagine it makes much of a difference. People will sit there cherry picking some microscopic move, but it's like, yeah, this one is actually 10 elo worse at 3,910.
Yeah, I know. So here, Niemann did well. He was 1 sigma up, 55. My average to the tournament is pretty much spot on. And let's see, his opponents his opponents actually matched the computer fairly well. Let's see, this was 2,700 ranked tournament. Okay, I didn't realize this tournament was so high. Wow, okay. And 0.061 average center pawn loss was second highest. Arjun Iragaizi. But you could say he induced his opponents to make errors. But everyone else had opponents playing, slightly lower in case of David Navarra and Salem Saleh, but noticeably lower for Alexei Shirov and Jordan Van Foreest. So again, slight, but noticeable effect of the opponents. Now, maybe Niemann has this kind of meddlesome style that plays more challenging game that induces errors from the opponent. I have a version of my model that tries to detect this phenomenon, but it's very delicate.
I would imagine two players that manage this would be Garry Kasparov and Mikhail Tal, actually.
Yeah, actually, it should be Alexei Shirov normally. And Tal certainly. My model does pick up enough of this style difference. The screening does not allow for that, but the full test does. And one of the things I did is using the version of my model that upweights positions that are critical, where there's more likelihood of a center pawn loss by the player to move. The third highest, right?
Can you predict that?
Well, yeah. So I set my model with this alternate setting I call expectation weights normalized, trying to be like Alpha Zero. But the problem with it is it might be better at detecting smart cheating by an actual smart cheater. But with online chess in the pandemic, there was a lot of not smart cheating. And in that case, clumping the distribution increases the baseline sigma and actually lowers the sharpness of the model. So it might be better for a person who cheats only in critical positions, but for the main, every move engine cheater, it was actually worse.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. So the first thing you have to say is basically is that Hans Niemann, there's nothing very that stands out, not even in a slightly unusual way about Hans Niemann's results.
for over the board chess.
Right. Right. What about the online?
Well, since August
You've
2020,
analyzed, I assume.
let's say I could vouch for him, and I don't think that would
Since
be
August what? Sorry.
contradicting other people's opinions. The difference of opinions are before that date.
From what date? Sorry.
August 2020.
Okay.
Late
So
August
as of
2020.
August
September
2020 to
2020,
today.
let's say. Yeah, September 2020 to today. I mean, this is in accord with what Niemann said, that it was early in the pandemic.
Right.
So as you see from the data points that I had, so I began doing Title Tuesdays in mid 2020, 2021, when Mark Crowther was able to assemble a complete index of the FIDE identities of people in the 2020. So then Mark sends a version with the real names and with the FIDE IDs. So that can index my work to the FIDE standard rating and my adjustment of it. So my data points for Hans Niemann are all from that mid 2021 date onward. And I guess I've been.
How many games were there roughly?
Oh, the typical Title Tuesday, whether it's split in two sections or not, gives you between 2,500 and 3,000 games.
Okay, so yeah.
So pretty substantial. And I run the chess.com files too, but the chess.com's ratings are highly inflated.
Sure.
So
it's not so much, right? I mean, I understand that for me, ratings is always a relative thing. I mean, yes, if my rating online is 3,300 compared to my FIDE rating of 2,300 or whatever, I will just assume that most players, if they all perform on a similar level in rapid chess compared to their standard chess, which is not necessarily the case, you just take off 1,000 points because these are different rating tools after all.
Right. See, in games, only the relative rating matters. But I have to interpret the rating system on an absolute scale.
Okay.
And one of my published results in a paper with Bartek Maciej and Guy Howarth 11 years ago, late Guy Howarth, is that the FIDE rating system has remained remarkably stable, that there has not been a huge amount of rating inflation. There are some inflation that can be explained by the faster time control and lack of adjournments relative to quality. But actually, it's the tide's been reversing since 2010. There's actually been deflation relative to my quality measure. So it's pretty much canceled out at this point.
So just for chess.com, I mean, do you have separate data analyzing his results in chess.com?
Well, yeah, but using the FIDE standard rating. Yeah, and a lot of that was in the file that I showed.
And your conclusions are?
That at least in September 2020, no evidence of any cheating.
Okay.
And,
that's pretty
and
conclusive.
really, well, my full date, it starts in June 2021. So.
Okay, so if there anybody was like concerned, let's say from the time that he 17, because he's said that yes, I in non-tournaments, non-conditions, I cheated when I was 16, and now he's 19. So 2020 would be when he was 17, and presumably he said, "Oh, I'm clean," and you're basically saying it's true.
So it's great that we finally meet and talk about things. Yeah.
I can. I've really loved it. I mean, it was far larger and greater than I ever expected. You're extremely generous in the your willingness to try to impart as much information as possible to explain your methods, what's going on in the process, how this process works. People don't imagine, I certainly didn't, the depth and detail that's involved in your systematic analysis of moves and players. Most people I've been seeing online and posting just basically when they do a computer analysis, like, yeah, I did all of the moves, and these are the amount of moves that deviate from the top move, and this in the top 3, and maybe it's like 0. this, and the overall average was 0.12 pawns or whatever. And it's very clear that you're way beyond that. That's just,
It's
You're
scientific.
looking at the
method.
rearview mirror and just going,
It's the scientific method, including controls and context, comparison data, all needs to be followed.